when you look at Galileo and his proposing the heliocentric model of the solar system and all the trial and stuff, you don't take everything he said, right? Now, Galileo had a theory about the tides as well, and that theory ended up being wrong, and whatever. And there's also his orbits were wrong. Apparently, Johann Kepler got the orbits better before Galileo and so you can find certain errors and stuff on the scientific grounds of what Galileo said. Okay, and so obviously it's fallacious to say, well, Galileo was right about Earth being in the center, so let's accept what he says about the exact shape and distance of the orbits. Right? You would never say that. Or Galileo was right about the Earth being the center of the solar system, so let's accept what he said about the tides. Well, no. Now, what I want to talk about is regime flavor. If you read any of Galileo's work, you would probably find that he is a very religious man. And he would include references here and there, probably sprinkled throughout the work, about God and God's plan and how God designed the solar system, and how this evidence shows that God did, design the universe in this way, right? And so if I take Galileo's work, compare it to whatever passages in the Bible the church was saying, and I say, aha, see, this is evidence, maybe not of that the Bible is wrong, because maybe the church is improperly interpreting the Bible, but at least it's evidence that the church is wrong, and use that as an argument against the church. Galileo would have none of that, because Galileo was a deeply religious man, and he was a firm supporter of the universal church at the time. So Galileo did not reject God, nor did he reject the Catholic Church. So if you were to use Galileo's work as an argument against the Catholic Church, well, Galileo might say, I never intended for my work to be used this way. But of course it is an argument against the Catholic Church. And Galileo supporting the Catholic Church, at least in principle, that's regime flavor. Okay, regime flavor. That's not the sign. Okay, Galileo says, okay, this is how we can know based on the movement of this heavenly body that the Earth is not the center of the solar system, or the center of the universe, or whatever it is he thought. And then he talks about, and this is evidence of God's divine plan and all this. Okay, talking about God's divine plan or seeing God's hand in the universe, okay, that's not science. Right? You've got to learn to identify the science and identify the regime flavor. So you need to identify the regime flavor and, discount it. Right? You can read Galileo and find some interesting stuff in there, okay, but recognize there's a difference between science and regime flavor. I believe there's similar stuff you can do with Isaac Newton and his views on alchemy, okay, and his trying to make the Philosopher's Stone, okay, or and I see this happening today in the case of Robert Putnam. Robert Putnam made a study talking about how people who live in diverse neighborhoods are unhappier. And Robert Putnam did a whole lot of controls for it, and he found a statistically significant, and according to him, independent effect of racial diversity in an area, and a bad effect. Higher criminality and less social capital. Social capital, he defined it in many ways, one of which is time spent, with other people, civic participation, whereas low social capital would be a lot of social isolation, small social groups, and TV watching. Okay. So Robert Putnam found that, and even after he did a whole bunch of controls. Now, I have a suspicion that he also did many spurious controls, meaning that, in a racially diverse area, you'd have lower educational attainment. And so then he would control for the educational attainment. Well, in doing so, you're also controlling for diversity, because diversity is controlled for that. So that would be a spurious control. Anyway, even after doing all sorts of controls, I'm just speculating that he made spurious controls. I don't know for a fact that he did. But whatever the case may be, Putnam doesn't reject internationalism, or I should say multiracialism. He doesn't. He supports multiracialism, and he supports the idea of a multiracial democratic state in spite of what his data says. Okay. Similarly, Galileo supported the Catholic Church in spite of data that the Catholic Church was wrong about a pretty big thing. So if you take Galileo's data, use that to indict the Catholic Church, well, the fact that Galileo personally likes the Catholic Church means nothing. Similarly, you take Putnam's data as an indictment against multiracialism. Well, the fact that Putnam likes multiracialism means nothing. Well, good for him, whoop-de-doo. So he has some regime flavor, but that's not the science. You could see a similar thing with Lysenkoism and epigenetic effects. Now, epigenetic effects are a real thing, and I believe that Lysenko found some epigenetic effects in plant life, but then went way overboard, greatly exaggerated them to the point of environmental determinism. Now, and of course, he then these epigenetic effects that he found were then interpreted as meaning that we can do this in humans, and we can create the new socialist man that Marxism requires. Now, or the Marxism, that is the progression to the stateless communist society, requires the man who will work without the incentive, without the individualized incentive. Marx never used the term new socialist man, but that was then later invented as a way to explain what what Marx's theory required. It required a man who was willing to work without a personal incentive, a man willing to work for the collective. And Lysenko's theories bolstered that. And so Lysenko's theories were then used to argue for the possibility of the new socialist man given the right conditioning. You condition him right and we'll get the new socialist man, and then we'll go on to stateless communism. But of course, in Lysenko's data, such that it was, nowhere was that there. Nowhere in the data regarding hardiness of seeds when exposed to cold temperatures, nowhere was there the new socialist man. Nowhere was there some proclamation that this is going to work in humans. Well, first off, it didn't really work in plants to the degree that Lysenko claimed, and it actually led to many bad harvests and which weren't arrested until the Soviet Union finally decided to re-embrace real genetics. But there was a little bit of truth in Lysenkoism in terms of that epigenetic effects do happen. Of course, he blew it all out of proportion, basically. And so you see there, regime flavor, right? The data says there are some slight epigenetic effects, right, that are passed on to multiple generations, in this case of plants. Okay. But then this was construed in a Marxist, new socialist man kind of way. So that's the regime flavor. The science is the epigenetic effects, right? Assuming Lysenko didn't falsify the particular study he was talking about, didn't falsify the data. So the science is the real data. Okay. The stuff about this supporting the hypothesis of the new socialist man, that's regime flavor, okay? Separate the two. Some more quotes on this. From Dr. Walter Gross, from 1940. The so-called theories of Einstein are merely the ravings of a mind polluted with liberal, democratic nonsense, which is utterly unacceptable to German men of science. Then we have from the Astronomical Journal of the Soviet Union that said, quote, "The theory of a relativistic universe is the hostile work of the agents of fascism. It is the revolting propaganda of a moribund counter-revolutionary ideology." Right? Now that's obviously regime flavor. Like if you're reading the Astronomical Journal of the Soviet Union, you know, you'll read some of the science, and then they'll have little things like this sprinkled in there, and you'll just, yeah, it'll go in one ear, out the other. It's noise, basically. It's noise. Similar to how Robert Putnam's saying, don't use my data to promote racial separatism. right? That's just noise. That's just his regime flavor noise that he is trained to support a democratic, multiracial state, right? That's regime flavor. It's noise. Now, I'm also looking at another thing. In fact, I actually took this example in this book, and I'll just quote straight from my book. It says, quote, "In the paper, Does Labor Diversity Affect Firm Productivity?" by Piero Paroda, Dario Pazzoli, and Mariola Pitlikova, it was found that while ethnic diversity in firms in Denmark correlated with firm productivity at negative 0.06, racial diversity correlated with productivity at negative 0.25, meaning there was a negative correlation of 25% between racial diversity and productivity. Now that's coming from their data, but then they go on to spin an alternative hypothesis. And here's what they say, quote, "On the contrary, diversity in demographics and ethnicity bring neither no or negative bring either no or negative effects on firm productivity." Well, first off, no or negative, it's negative 0.25. So for them to, anyway. Thus, the negative effects coming from communication and integration costs connected to a more demographically and culturally diverse firm seems to counteract the positive effects of diversity coming from better problem-solving abilities, creativity, and knowledge spillover, right? And of course, that's complete make-believe. Right? First off, the positive correlation with education diversity and productivity was 0.111, and the authors had no problem immediately concluding that education diversity positively impacted company productivity. The negative effect of racial diversity was negative 0.25. It was stronger than the positive effect of educational diversity, which they had no problem acknowledging. Right? They didn't say with educational diversity, there's either no or positive effect of it. No. They said there is a positive effect. Right? This is clear regime flavor on their part. I use their data because their data said, their data basically confirmed, what Putnam says. But then they have this, in the discussion session, it's just crap, right? Pure regime flavor. Now, when I read this, I just went one ear out the other. But then I thought, I'm going to include this. I'm going to include this because there are some people to whom this does not go in one ear and out the other. There are those people to whom this is like real to them, right? Where Robert Putnam's bullshitting about how to use his data is like a real argument to them, right? And these are the same kinds of people who would support the Catholic Church on Galileo's word. Okay, you saw a similar thing with the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study and Sandra Scar, twisting the results to say, okay, I'll just say it right here. The Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study was designed, and I'm just going to give some of my interpretation here. I believe it was designed specifically to prove that if environment is controlled for, racial differences in randomized samples will go away, or roughly go away. Now, there were some slight differences in the socioeconomic status of the adopting parents, but they weren't anywhere close to what exists in the general population, in the socioeconomic differences between blacks and whites in the general population. So even if they're not precisely the same, there was still a massive narrowing. So something like 80% of the variance was taken out. So now the blacks in the study are only about 20% behind in terms of the socioeconomic status that exists in the population generally. And what was found was no narrowing. That there was no, the gap was, I think the gap was even higher. I think it was like 16, or may have been 14. Anyway, it was. You can look it up on Wikipedia, Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study. You can see the age 7. And of course, age 7, the racial gaps aren't as big. And that's true generally, right? In young children. This is actually a result of gene expression. As you get older, your genes express more and more. And the heritability of traits in general increases with age. Whereas when you're a little kid, there's a great degree of parity. And it's only as you get older that you begin to look and act like your parents. Okay. So yeah, that's the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study, and Sandra Scar took those results and then said, well, I believe that these results show that that the racial gaps in IQ are down to environment, or it's inconclusive, some sort of bullshit. And you can read it on the Wikipedia page, right? The interpretation of Minnesota transracial is just more regime flavor, okay? You look at the data, that's the science. Scar's interpretation after the fact, where she says that, oh, it's the same, right? That's that's the regime flavor. That's not science, right? Separate the two. Finally, and this is what prompted me to make this video, was the Human Genome Project. The Human Genome Project. I hear it said all the time, and I get this trope, this talking point, that there are some people who worked on the Human Genome Project. And maybe I should find the quote here. Human Genome Project race quote. Like, here we go. It says, here's from the American Journal of Color Arousal. Oh, this is a blog. But anyway. The Washington Post claims that, Human Genome Project confirms that race simply does not exist as a matter of biology. DNA studies do not indicate that separate classifiable subspecies races exist within modern humans. With different genes for physiological traits such as skin and hair color can be identified between individuals, no consistent patterns of genes across the human genome exist to distinguish one race from another. There is also no genetic basis for divisions of human ethnicity. Now, in this video, I don't want to go into, existence of race. I'm going to make a video specifically just about that on this channel later. But the thing is, the Human Genome Project did not deal with race. Okay? It dealt with sequencing human gene. Like races don't differ in terms of differences in the actual genes that they have. They differ in terms of the allele frequencies on those genes. Okay? Now, the Human Genome Project doesn't deal with alleles. Okay, it doesn't deal with allele frequencies on the genome. It deals with where the genes are and which genes code for what. Okay, that's what the Human Genome Project does. It doesn't deal with allele frequencies. It doesn't deal with allele differences. It has fuck all to do with race. It has nothing to do with race. They never did a racial analysis in the Human Genome Project, either the publicly funded one or the privately funded one. Okay. So, but that's what you see here. That's something you see in the Human Genome Project when they say that race doesn't exist because we sequenced the human genome. Well, they didn't do a racial classification or racial comparison. They never did any of that. They literally just sequenced people's genomes to figure out how many genes there were and where they were and what they did in the humans. Okay, they didn't deal with the variations and frequencies of those genes at the locations. Okay, basically the Human Genome Project is creating the rubric. Right, it's telling you this is where the genes are, and this is what, roughly speaking. I mean, there's all sorts of genes activating each other and influencing each other, how they are expressed, but generally speaking, they're saying where the genes are and what they do. And that's the same, of course, in all humans. And there's no difference on that basis. And maybe that's what they're saying. They're saying that the gene locations all do the same thing, regardless of whether you're black or white. Okay, but that's of course not what race means. That's of course not how race is actually used or defined or classified or populations identified in population genetics. Okay, so it has nothing to do with race. But you'll see that quote used. And that's not, right, that's not the science. Nowhere in what they did they show that. That's regime flavor. That's the discussion section, right? And to me, when I read that about the Human Genome Project, that just, in one ear, out the other. I ignored it, right? Because that's not the science. Okay? The science of the Human Genome Project doesn't say the category of race doesn't exist, right? It says this is where the genes are, sort of, and this is kind of, sort of, what they do. Right? That's what it said. Okay. So in conclusion, be aware of regime flavor. Watch out for regime flavor. Okay? And don't confuse regime flavor for the real science. Learn to separate the two. And for people who are talking to me, don't bring me regime flavor. Okay? Don't bring me quotes. Don't bring me, a study where the data says X, but the scientist still says Y, and treat that as if there's empirical proof for their position, because it's not. That's regime flavor. It has existed for all of human history, and today is no exception.